Hello, this is Jim Schaefer, executive producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guests today are Fernando Coronil and Julie Skurski. Today we'll be discussing their research on the notion of violence and their book, States of Violence. Welcome to Rip Rap. Let's first talk about how this project took shape and how you worked with Ray Grew to bring together all these significant scholars like E. Valentine Daniel, Juan Cole, Vina Das, Charles Bright, and John Markoff.
Well, this is a truly collective project, and I don't know exactly how the idea was born, because I was recruited already when the idea had been gestated in the head of, I think, Raymond Grew, who I think was the person who came up with the idea. And I think you might want to ask him how is it that he imagined this project. But I think he recruited originally Val Daniels to organize a conference on violence. And one day I was, we were together in some kind of event at university, and Ray Grew and Val told me, hey, do you want to join me in this project? And so I said yes, and so I became part of the project. And later on then Julie joined us in the project. And so that's how the project got started. And it got started around the idea of doing the book. But previous to the book, the plan was to organize a conference. And if you want, I can tell you a tiny bit about the conference.
Yeah.
Okay, the conference was actually a tremendous event. It was event that was preceded by a course that was taught by Val Daniel, Julie, and myself, and some maybe like 20 graduate students on the subject of violence. And the idea was very much to reflect on various approaches to violence, and also to think hard about the articles that had been selected for the conference. Because in fact, I should have mentioned this, part of the idea was to organize a conference around previously published articles in comparative studies in society and history, and to invite new authors. And the idea was to as part of this project, was to revise all the past issues of comparative studies and select articles that were interesting, in that they were like very rich historically or ethnographically or sociologically, because after all it's a very transdisciplinary journal, but also theoretically sophisticated. And so we reviewed, a group of us, all the issues of comparative studies, and came up with what I remember, I think it's 6 articles, and then we invited 4 new authors. And so in that class, we read carefully the papers that were already published, and we asked 4 authors, complemented because of theoretical or area expertise, the articles that we had chosen, to submit papers also for the class. So by the time the conference took place, everyone had read not only a relevant group of theoretical works on violence, but also all the articles, and each paper was commented by 2 students. So it was a terrific conference in that the speaker basically summarized in 5 minutes the paper, but everyone had read the papers, and there were 2 students who commented on the papers. And so that's out of that then the book grew.
Well, and that's another point. It takes a lot of work. I mean, there's that initial idea, but then it takes a long time for something this complicated to really form and develop. So that fascinated me. And what got you thinking about the need to explore political violence? Did that just kind of emerge out of these topics?
I think in our case, we had just finished publishing in the journal Comparative Studies in Society and History an essay on anti-austerity program riots in Venezuela, in which several hundred people were killed by the government. And that happened in 1989. And just as Val Daniel had been working for quite a while on civil violence in Sri Lanka, and which had led him to look at much of the colonial roots of that kind of violence. In the case of our work on Venezuela, this was part of what was, I think, starting to occur in many parts of the world, which is popular protest against various kinds of neoliberal reforms. And so it started, I think, becoming more and more of a visible issue, the ways that previously less visible forms of everyday violence and social disparities and repression were becoming now more visible. So the very notion of political violence we thought needed to be really opened up and examined more fully.
And look below the surface.
Right. I think that was probably Ray Gru's idea. I suspect, when I guess when I cannot read into his mind, but the very fact that he chose as organizer originally an anthropologist like Val Daniel, who had done work on all kinds of forms of violence, not only the obvious ones, but also very subtle ones, like like the one he describes in his article on plantations in Sri Lanka, and also he welcomed the inclusion of two more anthropologists. I think suggests that he was exactly looking for that kind of approach.
As you point out in the book, violence is elusive. You think that you know what it is, but then you have to pay much more attention and do much more careful research to get underneath what that might be. And also in this book, there's the issue of defining what is violence, which I thought was really interesting. Maybe you want to talk about that, because it also got into that thing of violence is rhetoric and the rhetoric of violence. But there's some really interesting stuff about defining what is violence.
It's that, we struggle with that in part of the difficulty of doing the book was like we had this incredibly wonderful conference in which all these different perspectives were at play, and it was very creative in terms of participation of students and scholars with different ideas of what violence is and how to define it. And so only we felt that we were also engaging in some kind of form of violence if we define, or if we took the task of having a last word about it. So we experimented at the beginning with having a very different kind of book with different voices and all of that. But maybe the certain kind of violence of canonical forms imposed itself at the end, and we ended up doing this. And what we, with advice of book editors, we were told that actually it was more interesting to come up with an introduction that was our own and reflected our own ideas. But of course our own ideas is very much a result of collective work. And part of the struggle that we both engaged in was try to come up with a question of defining violence, coming up with not necessarily with a definition, but with a questions around the definition of violence, and that was central aspect of what we were trying to do.
I think that one of the things we're trying to do with that is point out, such as with the references to De Lauritas, what a political act it can be to even define what violence is or what violence isn't. So political violence then itself becomes part of what we're studying and looking at how very often in many kinds of practices the state defines others as committing violence, but its own actions are not seen as violent. So the politics right there in that kind of category are really important, and that's why the rhetoric becomes an issue in terms of not constituting violence, but really participating in defining and helping to motivate it.
No, what others do is violence. What I do is force, or exercising authority or defense of society. So it becomes a question of positionality very much, and that's part of what we're trying to do. To problematize and relativize the very notion of violence, and to link it up, to different levels. Not only the exertion of, let's say, physical harm, which is one of the definitions of violence, but also other forms of violence which are more subtle and more implicit. Not only rhetorical forms, but also structural forms of violence.
In the book, the articles cover a wide range of topics. I mean, you've got the rape laws in India, agricultural practices in Sri Lanka, ethnic conflict in South Africa, and other topics like the Venezuelan situation. But what I liked about having all these case studies is it created a challenge so the reader can't lapse into a simplistic interpretation. And I also like the fact that you were placing this work, as you were saying, within the scholarship of people like De Laurentiis, in a more substantive theoretical framework, with Foucault and Derrida's notion of the violence of the letter. Someplace along the line, there are the circumstances, but then there are also the motivations that come out of what people are saying and doing. And there's also Walter Benjamin and what he offers about the links between violence and order.
Well, I think that's in the whole title that we gave the book, States of Violence. That's one of the central things we wanted to do, is problematize. On the one hand, the states claim, the liberal states claim at least, to be the agent of order, and therefore legitimately be able to take all kinds of action, as well as present all kinds of rhetoric that are defined as establishing or maintaining order or suppressing violations of the law. And so it places itself, of course, outside of violence. So the violence that can be very much constitutive of the state, constitutive of the law, is something that generally goes unexamined, whether in political theory or also in studies of violence, because they tend to limit themselves oftentimes to that which can be empirically measured, such as deaths, for instance.
Your research on Venezuela might be a case in point of how the state can demonize its people, saying, well, they don't know what they're doing and we need to protect them, even as the state, is doing awful things to the people.
We were trying to, as we said, juxtapose those different meanings of state. So on the one hand, that set of institutions that's associated with order, on the other hand, those effective kinds of conditions. So bringing together the institutional and the individual, but not only that, the modern Western state has presented itself as the agent of rationality, both order and rationality, which are supposed to go together, and therefore not as a region of affect. But if you look a lot at what the state does, there's a great deal that is involved in and directed towards generating certain kinds of emotions on the parts of people. And so that's another thing that we wanted to somehow at least open up discussion to that. As we know, there's a great deal of love oftentimes for the state or for the nation, some fear as well. And so we really felt that should be looked at as central, not as a secondary dimension. What brought this article about, which is the analysis of
two massacres.
Two massacres. First, of some peasants on the border with Colombia, who the state disguised as being, I won't say the state maybe, but certain intelligence organizations and military branches disguised them as being guerrillas and presented them to the public that way, and had them killed.
I think you could fairly say the state, even the president of the country did that.
Yes, we're complicit in that. And so that was sort of a very coalescing kind of moment, which started bringing about a great deal of popular protest, because it did become emblematic, I guess, of people who were quite poor and marginal and anonymous, like literally nobody in terms of the life of the nation, way out there on the borders, being made into props, really, of this theatrical effort on the part of the state to invent menace and a security threat on its borders. And so I think it was around there, and this was before the riots that I spoke about in 1989, that a great deal of this contestation about the state's discourse as presenting itself as the voice of the people came into question. And instead, a great deal of the protest said, no, the people are being used or are being deceived or being killed. So to me, that was a really important process by which we could see before the outburst of massive riots how long-term practices and long-term usages of language had been building up into this sense of lived marginalization, lived contempt with which everyday people were being treated.
Yeah, this was a case what you were talking about the importance of language and labels, that the state would call these people guerrillas, and its violence against them as defense of the national territory. And on the other hand, the people, as they were able to articulate their position, because there were people who knew what had happened and stuff, then presented themselves as innocent peasants, virtuous citizens, and presented the state as actually criminal, as engaging not in the use of legitimate force, but in illegal violence. And so, again, the question of what is violence or who defines it became very critical in that moment, and even became more critical later with the riots of in February, in which hundreds of people were killed by the state. And again, the same kind of question about who, in what name is violence or is force being deployed? Is it legitimate force? In that case, it's oftentimes not seen as violence, or is it illegitimate force, and in that sense it's seen as violent.
How do you do research on the different, often unacknowledged domains within which power and violence are often organized? How do you find out about the silences and the information that are not given to you? In this instance, how do you find out the rest of the story, so to speak? Was it a matter of interviews, talking with people?
Lots of field work and lots of talking. In both cases, I went to the place where these people were massacred, talked to many people there, talked to the peasants, so did Julie. And in the case of the riots of February, lots of field work among people, and then gaining trust and confidence, and also noticing clues, things that are small details that maybe might not be particularly significant, but in the context then acquire tremendous significance.
Talking with people in families, relatives of people who had been killed, human rights organizations. But I think it really was crucial, the fact that we have both been working for a great deal of time on the history of the country, and with a sensitivity to how language is used in different ways. And I know in the case of my work, into looking at ways in which there are racial hierarchies which are denied. So this play between the visible and the invisible, for me, was very, very important in that sense. Venezuela, like a number of countries, at least in Latin America, presents itself, and many people think it is, a racial democracy. And there's an ideology of racial mixing as being positive, in contrast to this country, where racial mixing was always seen as negative, and in fact illegal until very recently in this country. So even trying to see then the very unexplicit and coded ways in which class and race were indicated within this supposed unified democratic nation in which the people are being represented, I think made both of us very much attuned to, when this started being questioned and breaking apart, to the language and to the actions that people were using, and not just interpreting things according to their surface appearances.
I think the state can set up a filtering process that it uses to manipulate and control the flow of information. And so they can just happen to omit who has died or what the circumstances were, or recharacterize, as you were saying, who was involved and why they were involved. All that becomes really crucial. I just find all that fascinating, but I know that it takes an enormous amount of work to override that and reach past it. And I think that's an important part of your whole project. Fernando, what was your trip like when you went to see what was going on in Venezuela now?
Now? Yeah. Well, actually, talking about now, it's very interesting, because as we mentioned in the article now, I mean, one of the things that happened when we wrote this article, in part moved by what had happened in Venezuela with this massacre, the two massacres, the peasants and then the riots, and then the state immediately tried to repress those incidents and to bury them from memory, from history, and to present them as an outburst of the irrationality of the masses who came and rioted and looted and stuff like that. But ironically now, because there has been a change in government, for Chavez, that's one of the fundamental moments in the new history of Venezuela, because that's a moment in which his own movement decided that it had to take action against the state, because the army had been deployed to murder innocent citizens, and that incensed the young officers who had been entrusted with that mission, and made them take an active role, and reinvigorated their decision to overthrow the government. So now those moments are memorialized in Venezuelan history as foundational moments in the new process of Venezuelan history. They're celebrated every year by the new government. But of course there are other incidents that are very complicated and partake of the same kind of dynamics of that incident, but in a new situation. Like, for instance, I'm doing research now on a coup against Chavez in the coup that succeeded for only 48 hours in April 11th of 2002, in which again there was a massacre that took place, and it's many of the same features that were present, dynamics that were present in the previous two massacres, were present in this massacre, in terms of questions of representation, of naming who did that, and how was that represented.
I keep thinking of that phrase, how soon we forget. All these really horrific things that have happened in 2001 on September 11 in the United States. But then there have been many other September 11 type events in other places on an ongoing basis, like Serbia, Ireland, Palestine, and those kinds of issues. I think there's something about violence that sort of numbs you, not only disempowers you. So you say, oh my gosh. And then this results in an inability to form a sense of history at all.
But I think that if you think even of September 11th, there are two that quickly come to mind. One, of course, September 11th, 2001, this attack in the heart of the U.S. By unknown forces in a way at the time, not like a conventional war. And the September 11th in the case of Chile in '73, when Allende was overthrown in the midst of the Cold War. And I think that what Julie was saying is that I think that the articles in a way are trying to deal with an historical arc, which is very broad and explores different modalities of violence in different contexts, which I think help understand the current situation, in which is not just a question of Cold War politics, but more varied forms of violence.
But there's also this thing that violence has consequences, and it plays forward to a certain extent. There's a scholar who has a book out now who's claiming that what happens in global politics is a consequence of the policies the United States has had in the past. That started me thinking about the current situation between the United States and Iraq, because my concern is we've set into motion dynamics that are just chilling to think about. And that's also been true of Latin America. The United States has been very active there and other places throughout the world.
The scars of violence. I mean, one of the things that we, in our own research in this particular case with the riots in Venezuela, one of the things that was amazing is how history is saturated and sedimented in complicated ways, so that when these people began rioting or protesting the imposition of austerity measures and fighting for what they thought were their rights, to have food and to have access to the barriers of life, the essential necessities, the state responded by calling them savages and exerting violence against them in a discourse that was very similar to colonial discourse against the barbarous masses in the primitive Indians in the Americas at the beginning of the conquest. So the depth of that kind of historical memory and how people then configure their own position within certain locations in society as civilizing agents. And concerning Iraq, I mean, this is long history of also colonial violence, and there are people, of course, and even the CIA has this term, blowback, that Chalmers Johnson has written a book about it, of how you engage in a particular form of action which disrupts things, and then there are going to be consequences, which are, the CIA intelligence calls blowback. And I think this is terrifying, because clearly the kind of situation that we're seeing throughout the world right now are going to have unintended consequences, which are very scary.
Well, colonizers can go into an area full of power and say, oh, we're going to set it all up to make it work more efficiently, not understanding, as you were saying, how saturated that area may be with reasons why that area is configured a certain way, and how embedded things have been working. Indeed, just rearranging can be a certain kind of violence, but it rarely stops at that.
That's right. And one of the things I think I like of the essays in the book is that they are very much, as one of the original questions about engage with theory, like Benjamin de Lauretis and Foucault and people like that, but also because they're written by historians and anthropologists who study very particular spaces, places with great depth, and also knowledge not only of particular occurrences at moments in time, but also the deep histories. There is a kind of dialogue with those theories which tend to question them as well. Like in our case, I remember that we also we use Foucault, but Foucault ends up producing some kind of typological, sequential view of history, and in which the states, have different kinds of states at different periods deploy violence in different forms. And one of the things that we argue is that of the heterogeneity of society, the complexity, the depth of different historical forms, and how states at any particular time can deploy distinct forms of violence. Can be, probably very technical forms of violence, very outward forms of violence, very explicit forms of violence, or more subtle forms of violence. It's very hard to make sharp distinctions between, transformations from one mode to another. And I think that once you have a view of the world in which you are not just thinking of Europe, but you are also taking into account the colonial world and the post-colonial world, you end up with a much more complex picture. And I think that this is one of the things that is happening now, that the different forms of violence are being exerted in all throughout the world. And the consequences are also going to be, in a way, shaped by those very complex histories.
Well, I think this is a fascinating book, Fernando and Julie, and all the case studies, plus the depth and detail of the research in each one, as well as the way that they're so solidly theoretically placed and developed, is just marvelous. We'd like to thank you both for being on Rip Rap. And Fernando, this is actually your second time since we did a program with you on your book, The Magical State. Thank you both for being on Rip Rap.
Well, thank you too.
It was a pleasure. It's a pleasure.
Right.
Maybe you can be again. When I finish the book, you have to invite me, the cookbook.